LiSTNR production.
Hey, it's Antoinette Lattouf with you. Welcome to The Briefing. So it's been a year since the October 7 attacks, a year today. 365 days on. What reflections do we have about conflict, justice, the role of social media, as well as the failings of Western leaders and international law to bring an end to what human rights groups have described as an unfolding genocide? On the previous episode, we spoke with the Jewish Australian lens on the anniversary, and on this one, we'll tell this through the eyes of a Palestinian who is also part of the LiSTNR family and whose struggles have been ongoing for 75 years, not just the past 12 months. Lem Zakharia is a twice displaced Palestinian. She's also the gun producer behind Abby Chatfield's It's a Lot podcast. And on today's deep dive, she gives her reflections not only on the suffering of civilians, but also the media framing of such atrocities and how so many more regular Aussies are invested in this bloodshed on the other side of the world that they previously weren't that interested in. Lem, thanks so much for joining me. It's been a wild 20 months, no matter which way you look at it.
Yep.
No matter how close or far you are from this conflict. And I say, conflict, and some people would even have problems with the word conflict.
Yeah.
You moved to Australia in recent years, but essentially, just to get to know a little bit more about you, you've been exiled twice as a Palestinian woman.
Yeah. So both my grandparents were kicked out in 1948. By both, I mean from my dad's side and from my mum's side. They were living in Jerusalem, and we had to go to Jordan after that. So from Jerusalem to Amman, the capital. So that's the first part of my journey of being displaced. The second part is that when I arrived to Australia as a tourist, I decided to apply for a protection visa on the basis of being a sexual minority because I'm queer. And having lived as a queer person in Jordan, I've come to realize that I can't be in the public eye and be gay at the same time.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how I've come to be twice displaced. But I don't think I've reflected as much about being displaced when I was applying for a protection visa.
Right.
But I feel like we've always been displaced, my family and I.
And so, given your family has always been displaced, what do you make of the past year? And I know for many, they mark it from the October 7 attacks. You may have a different framing and a different perception of that, but it is hard to escape the fact that the last 12 months have changed the region and much of the West's engagement in it.
Totally.
Probably forever.
Yeah, definitely.
What does that feel like for you looking back 12 months on?
Oh, man.
Or do you even look back at it within that lens?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So look, since this whole attack started back in October 7th, I was appalled, obviously, at what Hamas has done. So that was the beginning of it. And then obviously as it became a genocide in Gaza, I was not surprised. That's one thing that when people were asking me, how are you feeling? How are you feeling? I'm like, it's almost always been like that. So I think a lot of people who don't understand the historical context would assume that it all started on October 7th. And I don't blame people who don't understand the historical context because I didn't understand the historical context. I grew up in the Middle East and I didn't even know and understand the intricacies of it because I was also under that narrative of like, it's too complicated. I won't understand it. You have to be an expert. So even I, growing up in the Middle East, thought so. And it took me having to go and study in Lebanon, American University of Beirut, where like there was like an amazing secular history professor where I basically have a minor in history about this because I was like, I need to educate myself because I couldn't wrap my head around it. So having known the highlights throughout the years since not even 1948, even before then, I understand that it did not start on October 7th. And I also understand even more why people think it started on October 7th.
And why is that?
I think when the historical context is missing, it's very easy to go into like a blame game, right? Like you started it. No, you started it. No, you started it. But you started in 67. But you started in 48. But you did that. But you did that. And it starts becoming this kind of finger pointing, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I just clearly see it as an oppressor and an oppressed. And that is the lens that I see it through because I'm part of the people being oppressed. I don't think it's fiction what I'm saying. It is a settler colony, and even the UN recognizes that it's an occupied territory. So when you remove that, when you omit that, then you can definitely start saying, yeah, it's October 7th that started this whole thing. So I just think it's an omission of historical facts that leads this narrative.
What have you observed in the political and media discussion around the past 12 months being here that you think is uniquely Australian when it comes to Gaza? You know, given that you were raised in Jordan, you're Palestinian, you've lived in Lebanon, but here we are on the other side of the world. But obviously have a connection with Israel being an Australian ally.
I guess overall in the West, there is definitely a bias when it comes to reporting on this. It's just very clear to me. And I'm just going to say it. There are some implicit racist headlines going on around. I think Jan Fran does an amazing job unpacking that. I think using logic, because people don't like Palestinians using emotion to describe what they're going through. They like using logic. So Jan Fran does a fantastic job breaking it down. For example, the Israeli attack with the pagers was dubbed like a James Bond style attack.
Yeah.
So
and that it was like clever and quippy and like Hollywood-like. Yeah.
And it's like, that is inherently racist, because what it does is like, you know, when it comes to racism in general, I know people here also hate to be called racist in any way. Like I fully recognize that. And I also recognize that in Australia, and Jordan has racism in it.
Of course.
Like the place I come from has racism. And the thing about racism is it's very actually external in Jordan. Like you can hear somebody being racist and you know it. Whereas here it's very implicit and it's not in your face. And with racism, there's levels of how you get to be racist. The first is starting with just like discomfort sitting with somebody. And the very last stage is just absolute dehumanization. And I don't even want to acknowledge you as a person, right? And I just think some of these headlines, just like that, are so dehumanizing. And that is what I've discovered that's uniquely Australian, is how implicit it is. It is not explicit.
I do want to ask about how you respond to this question, which you no doubt have gotten many times over the past 12 months. Well-meaning people wanting to check in on you. How are you doing? How are you feeling? Like, how do you even answer that question?
I try to be as honest as possible because I believe that it's part of my advocacy to show my humanity. So if I feel I'm angry, I say I feel angry today. If I feel like I'm hopeless, I say I feel I'm hopeless. If I feel, you know, hopeful, I will say I'm hopeful. Because I feel that people, again, are dehumanizing Arabs right now. This is what is happening. You can see it everywhere if you actually take a look. And part of my micro way of managing that, I guess, is being very truthful about my responses to people, especially when it comes to emotions.
Is it fair to say for many in the West, October 7 and the year since has piqued a lot of people's interest who otherwise didn't think that much about the Middle East or share much on social media about the Middle East? What's it been like for you witnessing that shift?
I think I have mixed emotions about it. Like part of me is very elated, is very ecstatic, is very hopeful that like especially the younger generation are just doing an incredible job, like laying out the facts, talking about history, questioning the status quo. So I feel like really excited about that. And then at the same time, I feel so fucking sad that it takes 40,000 of us to be dead for people to kind of wake up to what's happening. Like at what cost? Like it just feels like our blood is so cheap. I know I'm talking in a way that's so uncomfortable to people. That again goes back to the question of when people ask me, are you okay? And I say like, no, I'm sad, I'm upset, I'm angry. Because I just think that people also can hold space for those conversations when they do ask these questions. And so I think that that's the reality of it, is our blood is so cheap that it takes 40,000 of us for people to be, all right, like let's actually scratch the surface here or below the surface and like look at what's happening.
Do you think it's dishonest to frame this conversation or this conflict as a Jewish versus Arab, or even to be even more reductive, a Jewish versus Muslim, which we know is not true because there are Arab Christians as well? Do you think that inherent framing is still the dominant framing as opposed to this being looked at as a colonial project or in the prison of an oppressor and the oppressed.
It's getting better. The younger people are not using these terms, I don't think, as much. Well, I'm talking about my own little TikTok rabbit hole. But so I'm Christian Palestinian, and I'm not saying it because I'm attached to it by faith. Like my culture comes from being like Christian. And people, don't often associate being Palestinian with being Christian. I think a lot of people try to put religion on it to skew opinions, I think, and kind of take sides, but it's definitely not a religious thing. Like my granddad, again, 1948, pre-1948, he was completely like having business relations and friendships and dinners with Jewish people. Like there was no like any of that, like you're Jewish, there was just none of that religious sectarian stuff happening over there. This is something that's, again, I think any conflict that takes place, especially when you have the divide and conquer mentality behind it, this is going to be the result. Is even Arabs are going to be like, you're Sunni, I'm Shia, you're Christian Maronite, I'm Christian. Like we are also fractured in our own ways, but it's deeply unhelpful to look at it that way, I think.
You mentioned that it took 40,000 lives for people to start being interested in that region. And we know that 40,000 is a conservative estimate because there are so many under the rubble or have yet to be identified. How did it make you feel seeing this spill over into Lebanon, a place that you have also lived?
Yeah.
In terms of, finding some peaceful resolution or a ceasefire?
Yeah, see, I have a historical connection to Palestine, but I have a personal connection to Lebanon. So I went to uni there. I lived for 5 years. I'm looking at the news and I'm like, oh my God, that's where I used to go get the bus to go to the beach. That's where my uni is. That's where I used to have Menaish in the morning. Like
that was bombed in central Beirut. You're talking about Kola?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also I have friends there and I'm texting them and they're like, they are not at an emotional capacity to even tell me how they're doing, right? Like they're paralyzed with fear. So obviously, like I actually took the week off from today because I'm mentally struggling. I'm really, really struggling. And I have to say that. Not because it's my default. I haven't been that way, but I feel like as a result of being so dehumanized, I feel like I have to say how I'm feeling. We, as Arabs, I think, I'm speaking on behalf of a lot of Arabs, especially in Australia and Lebanese Australians, we are really suffering. And I do wonder if it was Israel that 40,000 Israeli civilians have died, which would be equally horrific. Would we be getting the same treatment here in Australia towards this tragedy? Or would we be getting mandated mental health leave, for example? Like just on the level of the everyday life.
Or our government intervening and demanding a ceasefire, expelling ambassadors.
Exactly.
Imposing sanctions and using other diplomatic tools. My final question for you is, how do you critique the dehumanization of Arabs while still holding space for the sanctity of civilian lives? Because we know that 1,200 civilians were killed this time last year in Israel, which is obviously a human rights tragedy.
Yeah. So I grew up around anti-Semitism, and looking back, the region it's not justified. It's an awful thing. And I think having lived in Australia for the past 7-8 years, I have come to realize that they are one of the most displaced people in the world. I have made connections with many people in that community that have made me realize the errors of my thinking as well as like a child growing up in that environment. And I also really, I think if anything, it's actually increased my empathy because these situations have allowed us to have these conversations. And so of course I can hold the space for both. Like humans are humans. Right now I'm seeing Iran like bombing Israel, going like, what about the freaking kids going to school? Or not even the kids, the men, the women, like
anybody.
It's
everybody.
I'm not happy with that at all. And that's the thing it's like, yes, social media is amazing for a lot of things, but we're losing nuance here. We're losing the nuance that these are people that if this was happening to you, regardless of who you are, you'd be fucking horrified. Yeah. So they are also going through a lot of pain right now, Jewish people are, because they have a lot to lose. We have barely something to lose that we're holding on to, but they have a lot to lose. And they have a drive to protect, and you understand that. They finally found a place where they can be there in harmony without people stigmatizing against them, hating on them. And now they're really, really, really worried. And also, I'm pretty sure in Australia, they are also facing anti-Semitism as a result of this, because people are putting this on as like, but see what they can do. And it's like, stop saying they as if they're like this one cluster of people, because that is racist too. You know what I mean? So no, I have a lot of empathy, and I can really do both. Like, honestly, and a lot of Palestinians might not agree with me, by the way. I'm here speaking as one person from my experience. I just don't think it's helpful to have lack of empathy in any situation when it comes to that.
There's a lot to feel helpless and hopeless about. What are you doing to try and keep going, to have even that glimmer of hope? You just mentioned taking time out from work. You've mentioned being really honest, even if people don't want to hear how you're feeling. Is there anything else that you can do or advise other people who are feeling that level of hopelessness?
I just think, if you name it, it will have less of an effect on you. I think if you name it and say, I'm feeling hopeless right now, and address it and talk about it, not wallow in it. There's a difference. There's a fine line there. But I think if you name it, and which is what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to talk about my feelings. I think more people can open up to each other about this, because you'll realize that just like any other emotion, it's like the weather, it changes. And I am seeing a lot of people online going like, this is the end of Palestine, this is the end of Arabs, that's it. And other people going like, actually not a lot of people are saying this is the beginning, but I really, really have a lot of hope for the younger generation. I just think that they really know how to call bullshit, and the curtain has opened, the veil has dropped or whatever, and they can see through things. And I really think, like, I'm a disgusting optimist in that way. I really think things are going to change. I don't think people are going to be happy with this going on the way it has been.
Or the status quo from October 6th, resuming.
Exactly. If anything, yes, it's taken that many people to die. I do think that...
Or be killed. Even that passive language, it's creeping into you. They didn't just die of heat stroke. They didn't just die of heat stroke.
Yeah.
They were killed. Yeah.
I also think like a lot of people talk about the number of people who have been killed, but I'm talking about the level of trauma as well.
Yeah,
like you can imagine, like, I'm traumatized from 2 generations down. You're talking about generations of people here that are going to still be suffering for ages. This is not ending now, but I'm definitely hopeful.
Palestinian refugee and listener producer Lem Zakharia there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing, and that is it for now. But before you go, we would love it if you could share this clip with someone you think might be eager to hear it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. And we're also on TikTok and YouTube. You just got to look up Listener Newsroom. I'm Antoinette Lattouf. See you next time.